Hi everyone, I'm Jack Thremling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share some thoughts on Gargoyles by Bernhard. This is an early Bernhard novel. I want to say it was the second novel he wrote after Frost, and it's work that shows Bernhard developing the mature style that he would become justifiably famous for. I've seen some describe it as the way a dentist drill operates, and in the way that Bernhard wants to just absolutely penetrate a character, to get into that character's psychology, to examine the past and present experiences that have shaped this individual. And once he's cut deep enough and got to the core of the character, he then wants to pry the character apart. And from that to begin to examine, what is this person's purpose? Why does this individual exist, and why is that valuable? Why is that important? And from there to extend that question to begin to ask, why do any of us exist? What is the purpose of any one of us? How do these characters define their own purpose, and get us thinking around, how do we define our own purpose? And he gets towards that idea, particularly in the second half of the novel, really the final, I would say, like 30 or 40 pages of the book. He gets towards that summit. But this is definitely work that's on the journey there. The translation choice of Gargoyles is interesting because the second half of the novel is where we have this massive extended 100-page monologue that is broken up into paragraphs, unlike in Concrete. But the translation choice of Gargoyles is interesting because in the original German, the title would have been translated as Confusions or Disturbance. And I think the choice of Gargoyles points towards how the book opens. And we have a young man who's on sort of a weekend holiday from his college, and he decides to spend it with his father, who's the rural country physician, on the doctor's daily medical visits. And we open right away with just a very, depressing Bernhard-esque encounter where the first patient is a woman brought in who was assaulted the night before in a brawl at her husband's tavern. And she's been beaten to the point where nothing the doctor is going to be able to do will probably keep her alive. And that sort of plants the first seed around purpose, because we have a patient who the doctor's very aware he cannot keep this patient alive. Every medical attention he'll provide, he can do, but there's not anything he can do to really even keep this person alive throughout the full day. And the son is aware of that right away. And a later encounter sort of continues and plants another seed. And we have multiple encounters, perhaps the gargoyles of the title before we get to the grandest gargoyle, Prince Sarau. But a later encounter on the day's visits seems to sort of reinforce that question around purpose, because the doctor and the son interact with a much older woman who draws on memories and shares these memories. And it becomes pretty clear that the doctor's probably the only person she's been able to speak to and share these memories with for many, many years. But the doctor doesn't really tell these stories to anyone. His son is there to accompany him that one day, but it's not as if they continue to have these conversations. The doctor doesn't record these in a journal or anything. So even though he, that day, in that moment, acts as a repository for this woman's memories, in a sense, they're not moving on anywhere else. And so there's this way in which that starts to reinforce the questions around purpose. But that takes us to Prince Sarau, who is going to be, in some sense, the last visit of the day, even if he isn't quite the last visit, but he's going to be the visit that takes up the most time. And they head out towards what's described as this castle. And there are intimations, of course, of Kafka and Kay's efforts to reach the castle that never quite work out. But here we do end up with the prince, and we start to travel around his property, his estate. And we see, this is a character who is been weaned on Ecclesiastes, because he is right there to say, like, there is no purpose, vanity of vanities, everything I've been doing on this estate, just isn't going to work out. There was a flood that came through and wrecked everything, and constantly wants to draw the doctor, the father, into the conversations. But they're very much there as this audience. And that's when we begin to get into the prince's real psychology, because he says things like this. He goes, "Reality always presents itself to me as a ghastly procession of every possible concept. Theatrical effects, I always think, trying to escape from thinking. I am always thinking, for of course we are all condemned to thinking that nothing at all is actually real. Let us try it philosophically, the early centuries say. Let us try it practically, the later centuries say. Let us try it practically, philosophically, nature says. And of late, the prince said, people believe that progress is a matter of mathematical accumulation. No matter how we look at things, we can feel that the tendency is directed entirely toward death. Our teachers are dead and by always dying very early have escaped from responsibility. Our teachers have left us alone. There are no future teachers, and the ones of the past are dead. You can see that everything about many people and everything in them is pure theory, while others are the products of neither theory nor practice. Then what? But no human being ever has the possibility of being practical. We live by the assumption that problems are insoluble at night, soluble by day. That makes philosophizing possible. If we start to think about how we walk, it is soon no longer possible to walk, he said. If we start to think about how we philosophize, it is no longer possible for us to philosophize. And if we start to think about how we exist, we disintegrate ourselves in the briefest time. Cultures, the prince said, make exorbitant demands upon us. The oldest cultures, the greatest demands. But what destroys us is our own culture. And it's astonishing to reach that point where a character who seems to be wealthy, who seems to have everything that the characters across the first half of the book, who were just trying to eke out a daily existence, couldn't possess, has reached this point where that's how he's defining existence. That, it's almost this purposeless, just stay in line, follow the rules and stay in line. And as soon as you stop to reflect on any of it, the line that we're all following just disappears and everything falls apart. And it's a very dark, certainly dark way to define life, an almost nihilistic way to define life. But Bernhard is working towards that, and he puts these words into the mouth of a character that the father and son view in some ways as a character who's mentally ill. They refer to him as insane or a madman at times within the narration of the book, and yet that Bernhard has us viewing this character who, in a sense, acts as his mouthpiece, I think, in some ways, particularly with the relationship that the prince seems to imaginarily have with his own son, reflects some of Bernhard's own views, and yet he's putting them in the mouth of a character who is viewed by other characters as not reliable. So let's hear what else the prince has to say. The majority of mankind devotes itself wholly to its two chief pursuits, purchasing and consuming, he said. Strictly speaking, over the course of millennia, as we now see, the prince said, men have developed only these two instincts, the instinct to buy and the instinct to consume. Perhaps that shocks us, Prince Sarau said. Perhaps we should be horrified by this. Everyone, he went on, speaks a language he does not understand, but which now and then is understood by others. That is enough to permit one to exist and at least to be misunderstood. If there were a language that could be understood, nothing more would be needed. We always found a refuge in a problem, he said. People walk with one another and talk with one another and sleep with one another and do not know one another. If people knew one another, they would not walk, talk, or sleep with one another. Do you know yourself? I often ask myself, Prince Sarau said. It's fantastic to see the way that this character's ramblings and sort of elliptical, philosophizing reaches these points that do seem accurate. The way in which we communicate, the way in which we're constantly trying to approach each other and to have some glimmer of an understanding, even though we accept that perhaps we will never truly understand another person. And when we reflect on ourselves, it can be hard to trace why we do anything, why we have these careers, why we read these particular books, why we're married to the individuals we are. My wife and I have joked about the idea that it feels in some sense that our relationship could be a cosmic accident. We didn't grow up near each other. We randomly ended up going to the same university, randomly were assigned, positions. I knew I was assigned to a hall because my wife, not because of my wife, but I was assigned to the hall where I met my wife because I was interviewed by someone who lifted weights with the guy who was the director for the hall. That guy didn't do his homework and just said, hey, give me a couple names, and selected individuals that way. And that's how I ended up with a job in that building. And my wife randomly, was essentially assigned from the pool to the building. So for us to be able to meet like that does feel like an accident. And yet in some ways, is there perhaps a purpose that we take advantage of those moments of misunderstanding that can lead to understanding? That's perhaps my own more hopeful spin on this. But there's an aspect of the prince's monologue that becomes very interesting, and I think it gets towards Bernhard's own biography. That is the way that the prince at one point starts to identify how he's done everything he can to sort of salvage the estate, and he in a sense lectures his family, who he views as intellectually beneath him. But he then has this extended portion where he imagines his own death and what his son will do to the estate, how his son will ruin everything at the estate as quickly as possible, how his son despises him, the ways in which his son will sit in his study and reflect on the prince's death, which he notes. He has his son postulating that he himself will have died by suicide, and so there's a deep despair to the prince's narrative, but it's interesting to view Bernhard creating a character who in some ways espouses his own ideas and yet has rather the biography of his own father, who he never really knew, and who in fact did die when Bernhard was young. And to then postulate this son who's writing all of these ideas out and journaling and reflecting on how he'll destroy the estate, when in many ways Bernhard did in some ways repudiate his father, did look to repudiate his father's heritage. And so that becomes interesting. But I'll leave with one final reading before we note some connections. He goes, I no longer have the desire to observe people and consider everything they have to touch as artificial creations. I have already exhausted myself in contemplation. One exhausts oneself very rapidly in contemplation. Suddenly the prince said, I feel that I am rotting at a fantastic speed. I hear myself rotting. I hear it and want to get away from the place which I suddenly become aware of as the site of decay. But it is too late. I am no longer able to call out my name. I want to call out my name and choke over it. I look down upon myself from high above and observe you are no longer anything. The fact is, the prince said, in many dreams, I am walking through an endless hall toward an audience, which is the most important audience of my life. Since the hall I am walking through is a high, dizzying hall, an infinite hall, the audience is not possible. And because the hall is an infinite hall, it is not possible for me to find out who is supposed to receive me in the audience. I want to know who or what is receiving me, will receive me, but I walk and walk and walk and do not find out. There are times when I tell myself you have nothing left but hopelessness, and you must be content with that. Nature is, as you may know, a monstrous, universal surrealism. But in fact, the prince said, whoever is listening to something you are talking about approaches only as far as its outermost boundary. Our whole life is nothing but an approach to the outermost boundaries of life. And I think there we have it. That in a passage that, again, feels very similar to the sort of surreal nightmares of Kafka, this endless hall that he's walking through in his dream and has no idea who he's going to meet down there. Will he explain himself? Will the person be happy to see him? Will the person be disappointed in him? Is he disappointed in himself? All of these endless reflections that could occur along that perambulation through an infinite hall, I think reveal ultimately that sense that just as he will never actually reach the end of that hall, everyone's conversation ultimately reaches some outermost boundary that doesn't quite actually achieve its effect. And yet still we hear our communicating. So it's a wonder to reach those moments in this book, even if the full work isn't quite as strong as perhaps Concrete, which I would say is a much better entry into Bernhard's novels. I think the influence of Schopenhauer on Bernhard in Gargoyles was massive. Not only the comments around purpose and existence and even how each of them and the characters in Bernhard's books discuss suicide, but the influence feels very strong. I mentioned, of course, Kafka's Castle. That felt very relevant. But the other work I would point to would again be Samuel Beckett's trilogy, and perhaps Malone Dies as much as Molloy, and the way that language, of course, is not quite reaching its desired effect, and we're pushing at the limit of what language can achieve. And yet we continue to read the novels that these folks continue to write. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know if there is a favorite novel you have from Bernhard. I'm going to be slowly working through his novels as he's a writer I've been intrigued by. So hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.